And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. There is a popular meme that's been on the internet for a while that you probably have seen at least once or twice. It shows the picture of a beautiful cabin out in a remote area of the woods. Very primitive, nothing around it really. And the caption on it says, "Would you be able to stay in this cabin with no TV, no internet, no video games for a month or 2 months or whatever it is? Would you be able to do that to win $1 million? Could you stay out in this remote cabin? It's beautiful, beautiful cabin, beautiful area, but you would have no internet or video games or telephone or TV or anything." And the implication is that cutting yourself off from civilization like that is extremely difficult. It's very hard to do. So hard, in fact, that's the point of the meme, that if you can do it, if you can rough it like that for a certain period of time, you would win a big cash reward at the end. And quite frankly, I think it would be hard for a lot of people to do that. It would be incredibly difficult to go out and stay in a cabin and cut oneself off from civilization. Because we, as a culture, surround ourselves with noise and messages. We fill our lives with it. It is one giant stream of messages, whether they come through a cell phone, through the television, through the internet, what have you. We are constantly filling our lives with stimulation, visual stimulation of some kind, and many times we're engaging in more than one at once. It aggravates my wife to no end that we'll be watching a television show, and at the same time, I'm sitting on the couch or laying in bed doing something else on my cell phone, watching another show. And she always says, "How can you do that? How is that possible?" Well, what can I say? I'm talented. There's a lot of people that do that. It's called multitasking, engaging in more than one at once, more than one activity. And the idea is we are so afraid of quiet and silence that we will do anything to fill that void. We will do anything to keep stimulated electronically. And that's why our message this morning and our readings this morning are so difficult for us to think about, because they're about getting away from that noise, getting away from that stimulation, and returning to God. Start in the Old Testament. 1 Kings 19, the well-known story of Elijah. Now, if you go back a chapter to chapter 18, Elijah has just had this wonderful victory. God has helped him defeat the prophets of Baal, which was a false god. It was that great contest, remember, with the two bulls and to see who could get the bull to light on fire. God, of course, gave a great victory to Elijah, and he slaughtered the prophets of Baal. But right after that victory, Jezebel, the evil Jezebel, who was queen at the time, found out what had happened, and because she was a Baal supporter, she was determined to kill Elijah, to take his life. So Elijah runs up into the mountains. and basically says, Lord, I've had enough. I've had enough of this. They've killed everybody else. Now they're trying to take my life too. And he just basically sits there and says, just take my life, Lord. Get it over with. I can't go any farther. That's when he is visited by an angel and comforted and strengthened and given bread and water. So now he travels to Horeb, where he's going to encounter God. He's going to take his complaints directly to God. And that's where we are this morning, where we see God come to Elijah. But he is not in the mighty earthquake. And he is not in the whirlwind, in the loud wind. And he is not in the roaring fire. He is instead in the still, small whisper. And in fact, some translations of the Bible read the silence. God speaks to Elijah in the silence or in the whisper, which Elijah would not have heard if he had been waiting for God or listening for God in the loud moments. Elijah could only hear God when he was quiet, in the silence, in the whisper. Our gospel reading this morning from Matthew is also a well-known story. It is the story of Peter and Jesus on the water. And usually when we think about this story, we think about Peter's faith, or in this case, the lack of it. Because Peter sees Jesus out on the water. He says, Lord, if that's you, bid me to come. Jesus says, come on, Peter. Peter rushes out and then starts to sink. And Jesus has to rescue him. And he says, where's your faith? So usually when we think about this story, we think of it from Peter's perspective. And we usually talk about a lack of faith, and we just need to trust Jesus more. That yes, there are times where we're going to sink. Jesus will be there to rescue us, but it's really a story about our lack of faith and our need for greater faith in Jesus. And all of that is certainly true. I don't mean to discount that. But that's from the perspective of Peter. I would like to look at it this morning from the perspective of Jesus, and especially what happens beforehand. If you go back to verse 23, Jesus has put his disciples in a boat and told them to go ahead. You guys go on ahead. And so now he's left with the crowds. And it says in verse 23 that he dismisses the crowds. After he dismissed the crowd, he went up the mountainside by himself to pray. Jesus went up the mountainside by himself to be alone with God in the quietness and to pray. To be with God, to talk to God, to listen for God, and to be strengthened by God. And this is not an isolated example. This is not an isolated incident. Jesus did this all the time. The Gospels tell us that Jesus went off to be by himself before he chose his disciples, before Peter made that great confession of faith, where Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," before the transfiguration, when Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on the mountain and was transfigured before them into a dazzling white, appearing with Elijah and Moses. Before he taught them the Lord's Prayer, when they came to Jesus and said, "Lord, teach us to pray." And Jesus showed them how to pray. And perhaps most importantly, on Maundy Thursday, before his arrest and trial, he left his disciples before his meal with them, went to the garden alone to be with God, to pray, to talk, to listen, and to gain strength. Before the choosing of the 12, before Peter's confession, before the transfiguration, before the teaching of the Lord's Prayer, before the Last Supper, Jesus recharged his batteries, spiritually speaking, so to speak, by going to be by himself, by going off alone to talk to God, and perhaps most important, to listen, to be strengthened, to be refreshed. Are we doing that? Are we doing enough of that? It seems like in our world today, in our busy world, we try to squeeze God in where we can. And we may try to grab a few minutes with him in a car, listening to Christian music on the radio, or perhaps listening to some preaching. We may try to hurriedly read a verse of the day off of our cell phones in the morning as we rush out to work. We may try to grab little pieces of God here and there. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying those things are wrong. But there is so much more to it than that. There is a God who wants us to be truly in communion with him, who wants to speak to us, who wants to guide us, who wants to refresh us, who wants to empower us, if only we will stop and listen in the silence. Which, as I said, nowadays is incredibly hard to do. Silence doesn't just happen. You've got to make an effort to make it happen. All of you know our good friend Marjorie Carmody, a member of this church for many years, still living at home. I go to visit her at least once a week just to check in on her, see how she's doing. We have wonderful visits. And I would imagine most of you, in your time with her, those of you that take time to visit with her, probably have visited her home now and again. It's a beautiful old home, and she's got a porch in the back, an older section of the house that she calls her quiet room. It's where the old logs from the original house are exposed and still there. It's got a fireplace. Very warm, very intimate. Those logs, that room must be 150 years old, at least. And she has told me on more than one occasion, if you ever get run down, if you ever feel like the pressures of life are overwhelming you, or your job, or you just need a place to sit and be quiet, you come here and that room is available to you. And when I heard that, my first thought was, I don't have time for that. It's a very nice offer, and I know it's sincere. But I don't have time for that. I've got to be here, here, and here, and I've got to do this, this, and this. And quite frankly, I have not yet made it over there to do that. But the more I think about it, the more I understand what she's saying. Because I know she's done that. I know other people have done that as well and been blessed by it. They have sat in that room, and there's nothing magical about the room. What's powerful is the quiet, is the shutting off of cell phones and computers and internet and television, and just sitting there and listening for God in the silence and listening for God in the whisper. We all need to do more of that. We all need to stop and listen. And it doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen just out of nowhere. We have to make an effort to do it. Just as you give yourselves 20 minutes to eat breakfast, or 20 minutes to shower and dress, or 20 minutes to do whatever, I encourage you today to give yourselves 20 minutes to sit and be alone with God. And if you want to come here and sit in this beautiful sanctuary and enjoy the quietness, I can tell you there's no better place to do it than that. We all want God to talk to us. We all want God to tell us what to do. I can't tell you how many times I have had people tell me that. If only God would tell me what to do. If only God would show me what to do. I think He will. I know He can. But it requires something on our part. To shut off the distractions. To shut off the phones and the internet and the televisions. And to be still and to know that He is God. Amen.